Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today for our webinar on the Advanced Clean Trucks program. This is the second to last of our stakeholder engagement webinars, and we will be talking about the Advanced Clean Trucks rule. We appreciate your attendance today. Next slide. So this meeting is for the Department of Environmental Quality and the Division of Air Quality to provide the interested stakeholders with an overview of the proposed Clean Trucks program. During this webinar, we will be asking some questions along the way, and we would like to hear your thoughts and ideas. Next slide. Couple of housekeeping items. During the webinar, you will be muted. Please raise your hand, or if you're on the phone, hit *3 to be unmuted to respond to one of the questions we ask. You also may submit questions and responses in the chat box. In the event that we do not get to all of your questions, because this is a time-limited webinar, please put them in the chat, or you can email them to us, and information will be provided at the end of the webinar to let you know how to do that. This webinar is offered in English and Spanish. So when you ask questions, please try to speak slowly and clearly so that our interpreters can translate. Please be respectful by staying on topic. This is not a public hearing. Those will be offered later. This webinar is also being recorded and may be shared online at a later date. Next slide. We're providing here an acronym list because we use a lot of acronyms. We're going to try very hard not to do that today. But in the event that you are unclear about what we're talking about, these slides will be on our website and you can access them at any time. Next slide. Just to level set what we're talking about today, the sizes of the trucks is important. So the truck sizes range anywhere from a Class 2B truck, which is like your Ford 650 heavy work truck, all the way up to what's called a Class 8 tractor trailer truck. There are lots of trucks in between that also will be in this program. Those can be your Amazon box trucks, your delivery trucks, your PepsiCo delivery trucks, and your beer trucks, and also waste haulers or trash trucks. Go on. Some of the things you can expect to hear today is a review of our executive and departmental actions, an introduction to the California Advanced Clean Trucks program. We'll summarize our transportation and emission profiles. We'll discuss more in detail the North Carolina Advanced Clean Truck program, and so we want to solicit input and feedback from you. And now I will turn it over to Zach Pierce. Thanks, Zach.
Thanks, Robin. Maybe I'll start with just a sound check to make sure folks can hear me. Okay, I'm getting a thumbs up. Well, good afternoon. Want to reiterate Robin's thanks and appreciation to everyone who's joining us on this webinar. We're really excited to talk more about the Advanced Clean Trucks Rule. My name is Zach Pierce, and I serve as a senior advisor to Governor Cooper, focus on climate change broadly and spend a lot of my time on our work in the transportation sector specifically. We're going to spend the majority of today's session talking about this Advanced Clean Trucks regulation specifically. And so to start, I thought I would take a step back and provide a little bit more context around how this initiative fits into the governor's broader efforts on climate and clean energy. And so this slide that we're looking at provides some examples of the work, relevant work that's taken place going all the way back to 2018 when the governor signed Executive Order 80. That order really established this administration's platform on climate and clean energy. It established emissions targets for the state to reduce greenhouse gases, established the state's first zero emission vehicle targets, 80,000 zero emission vehicles on the road by 2025, and kicked off numerous processes and stakeholder engagement opportunities to all designed to progress the state towards those emissions targets. Some of those may be familiar to you. One example would be the Clean Energy Plan, which ultimately led to the passage of House Bill 951 and now the implementation of the Carbon Plan that was recently approved by the North Carolina Utilities Commission. Fast forward to July of 2020, the governor signed on to a multi-state effort, a multi-state memorandum of understanding focusing on what we refer to as these medium and heavy duty vehicles. So the many trucks and vans and buses that Robin just outlined in a previous slide, collectively we're referring to those vehicles as medium and heavy duty vehicles. And so this initiative was an MOU with, at the time, 16 states. That number has increased over time, all working on ways to support the transition to zero emission technologies in the medium and heavy duty vehicle sector. So through that MOU, we established new sales goals of ZEVs, zero emission vehicles, and also worked with other states and partners to develop an action plan with dozens of recommendations that the state can utilize to further this transition. Moving forward to just about a year ago now, the governor issued Executive Order 246. And so this executive order really built on the previous work of EO80, the medium and heavy duty MOU, to update the state's greenhouse gas reduction goals, updated the state's zero emission vehicle goal. So if you'll recall, we have a target of achieving 80,000 zero emission vehicles by 2025. EO 246 increased that target to 1.25 million zero emission vehicles by 2030, which is both a reflection of how quickly the market is changing and how quickly these vehicles are being adopted, but also how important it is for us to reduce our emissions in this sector to achieve our greenhouse gas and other pollution goals. EO 246 also kicked off the development of the state's first clean transportation plan. And so this is an effort that has been facilitated by our Department of Transportation over the last year. We're kind of nearing the final stages of that process. I know that many folks on the line today have spent your valuable time and provided your expertise working on some of the work groups that have informed that plan. And one of those working groups is a medium and heavy duty working group that's really focusing in specifically on these vans, buses, and trucks and how to support the transition of these vehicles to zero emission technologies. And then finally, last October, the governor issued Executive Order 271, which is really the primary reason that we're here today. So this order took another step outlining key actions and strategies, including the Advanced Clean Trucks Rule, which we'll discuss more today, to support this transition of medium and heavy duty vehicles to zero emission technologies. And we can jump to the next slide to talk more about Executive Order 271. So before I get into the details of exactly what the order does, I wanted to just briefly discuss the motivation for focusing on this work. In the broader realm of climate and clean energy and our clean energy economy, why are we focusing in on medium and heavy duty vehicles? Well, there are a few answers to that question. One of the really important aspects of the work and opportunities of this work has been growing North Carolina's economy and creating jobs in the clean energy sector. We've seen enormous economic growth just in the last 2 years. We've celebrated some of the state's largest economic development announcements in our history, and those have all been in the clean energy space. And the medium and heavy duty vehicle subsector is no exception to that broader trend that we're seeing. North Carolina is a leader in the manufacturing and associated supply chain of these medium and heavy duty vehicles. And we are seeing in the industry a significant transition and shift to zero emission technologies. You can look at the commitments that we've seen from the auto manufacturers that are making these vehicles. You can look at the commitments that we're seeing from the buyers of the vehicles, large commercial fleet owners who are saying they want to transition to zero emission technologies, whether that's to save money on fuel costs and reduce price volatility, or attract a competitive workforce, or reach sustainability goals. These purchases are happening. And you combine those trends with the federal government's largest ever investment in clean energy technologies generally, and these vehicles specifically. And our theory of change, our sense is that it's not a matter of if this transition is going to happen, it's a matter of when. And in the near term, it's a matter of where. Because we know that these vehicles will not be deployed evenly across the country. And so we want to make sure that in North Carolina, we're doing our work to be prepared and ready to ensure that this global market transition is benefiting us locally here, creating local jobs, and cleaning up our air here in North Carolina. So that's one of the first big reasons. We want to make sure that we're taking advantage of the economic opportunity that we see out there in the market. Another big piece of this rule is making sure that we maximize consumer choice. I mentioned that we don't think this transition is going to happen at the same time everywhere across the country. And as you look at the deployment of zero emission vehicles in the light duty sector, we've seen that states that are prepared, are early actors, and are passing sales requirements like the Advanced Clean Trucks rule that we're going to discuss in more detail today. Those are the states that get these newer, cleaner, and increasingly more affordable vehicles on their lots. And so we want to make sure that North Carolina small businesses and companies have access to these newer technologies as soon as they become available. And so that's a big piece of this order. Last, but certainly not least, I'll just speak to the fact that reducing emissions in this sector and transitioning to zero emission medium and heavy duty vehicles is critical to achieving the governor's climate and environmental justice objectives. We've seen just in the last few years with our updated greenhouse gas inventory that the transportation sector is now our leading source of emissions. And that's the case nationally, and is a trend that we've experienced here in North Carolina. These medium and heavy duty vehicles, these buses and trucks, only comprise a little over 3% of the on-road vehicles in the state. It's a small share, but because they are the most frequently used, if you think about an Amazon delivery van, and often the most polluting vehicles, they have a disproportionate impact on the state's greenhouse gas emissions. They also have a disproportionate or responsible for a major share of local air pollution, whether that's NOx emissions or particulate matter. We know this air pollution harms all of us, but it particularly harms low-income communities, communities of color, and other historically underserved communities that are most frequently living and working around these major trucking corridors or logistics hubs where there's a prevalence of these vehicles. So by supporting this market transition, by establishing forward-looking policy and stakeholder processes to get North Carolina ready, we know that we can continue to grow our economy, enhance consumer choice, and achieve our environmental justice and climate objectives. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, I'm going to be very brief on this slide just because this slide is a nutshell of the remainder of the presentation. But basically, the first section of Executive Order 271 directs our Department of Environmental Quality, including my colleagues on the phone on the webinar this afternoon, to develop an advanced clean truck program for consideration by our Environmental Management Commission. And that's what we're here to discuss with you today. We are in a pre-consultation period for the rules. And the order directs DEQ to propose the formal regulatory package to our Environmental Management Commission by May of this year. Next slide. Okay, I want to be relatively brief on this slide, but I also want to make an important point, which is Executive Order 271 includes advanced clean trucks, of course, but is not limited to the advanced clean trucks rule. One of the most important pieces of feedback that we received as we were meeting with stakeholders to develop the executive order was the perspective that you cannot just have the advanced clean trucks rule. You cannot just require the manufacturers to sell these vehicles if you are not also focusing on a complementary strategy and a holistic strategy to ensure that there is a functioning market that will ensure demand for the vehicles. And this is where making sure the charging infrastructure is available comes into play, or making sure that we are developing our workforce comes into play. All sorts of other considerations that are built around to complement and support the success of the Advanced Clean Truck School, because we know that that rule cannot ensure this market transition alone. And so the other 6 directives in Executive Order 271 really are outlining this whole of government approach to supporting a successful, a reliable, and an affordable market transition. Whether that's making sure that we're fully leveraging our federal funds, the unprecedented funding that we're seeing through the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law to support strategies that are identified in the North Carolina Clean Transportation Plan, strategies that have been identified through the action plan that was created as part of the governor's involvement in the MOU I discussed previously. We need to make sure that when I talk about the sentiment of advancing environmental justice, there is a lot of real work that needs to take place to realize that sentiment. And so our Department of Health and Human Services is working to further our understanding with mapping and data analysis to make sure that we know where those specific communities are, that we want to make sure we are targeting investments to. We need to build out our grid, the fueling and charging infrastructure that we know is going to be needed to support these vehicles. And there's an assessment and a study that has been directed by the order. We also want to make sure that state government walks the talk when it comes to these transitions. And so we are working to transition our own buses and trucks to zero emission technologies and to partner with the private sector and businesses with technical assistance and other collaboration to do that in a way that makes sense and is informed by the latest technology development and programming. So I'll conclude there and just say, we're really excited about this work. We're excited to hear about Advanced Clean Trucks specifically today. But this is just one of numerous efforts that was outlined in Executive Order 271 to ensure that we're achieving our clean energy, our environmental justice, and our climate objectives. So with that, I will turn it back over to my colleague, Robin. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Zach. And I apologize, I didn't introduce myself at the beginning. My name is Robin Barrows. I work for the Department of Environmental Quality, specifically in the air quality section. I'm a supervisor in the planning section, and presently I am working in the director's office. So my next task during this presentation is to give you that 40,000 foot view of the California Advanced Clean Trucks Rule. So the Advanced Clean Trucks Rule is part of California's holistic approach to help them reduce their greenhouse gas emissions from the large-scale, medium, and heavy-duty vehicle sector. It also helps them decrease NOx emissions, PM emissions, and SO2 emissions from this same sector over time. They do that in 2 ways. This Clean Trucks Rule is specific to sales targets for manufacturers. So the sales of zero-emission vehicles increases over time, slowly. I'll talk about that more in a second. There's also a requirement for the manufacturers to provide some reporting on their sales. Next slide, please. So in California, their rule takes effect in 2024. This is going to be a little different for North Carolina, and one of my other colleagues will talk about that in the future. But in 2024, the sales targets for certain classes of trucks needs to be at these percentages. So for the smaller vehicles, the class 2B through 3, the sales need to be at 5%. For classes 4 through 8, the sales targets need to be at 9%. And for classes 7 and 8, which are your bigger vehicles, those sales targets need to be 5%. These sales targets increase over time so that more of these zero-emission vehicles are available and sold to help reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide. I'm going to transition now to North Carolina's transportation corridors and the emissions profile. Next slide. We know that we have a few major interstates going through our state. This map is produced by the North Carolina Department of Transportation, and it shows the annual daily truck traffic, but this was in 2014. We know that today this truck traffic has increased. We also know that the truck traffic has spilled over into your local smaller areas. There are more Amazon delivery trucks in my neighborhood now than there were 10 years ago. Next slide. This particular map shows where we know manufacturing is across the state. So we have manufacturing along some of these transportation corridors, but we also have manufacturing in smaller areas and it's starting to push out into the rural areas. We know this as well. Next slide. You can't have manufacturing without having someplace to put the manufactured goods. Someone like Pepsi can't keep everything that they manufacture in their own site. So we have transportation warehousing type of facilities across the state. These particular facilities house the goods for someone like Pepsi so that they can move across the state at a later time. These are generally located close to the interstate corridors. However, they are slowly starting to move out into more rural areas as well because of demands on land use. Next slide. Wholesale trade organizations are those that purchase in bulk lots of different things, and then they sell them to the retailers. So this is kind of an in-between step between your distribution centers and your retailers. So this is where a lot of goods are going. So if you go to the mall and you go to a store at the mall, they can't possibly hold all of the goods that they sell in that store all year long. So these are the places that hold those goods during that time period. Next slide. We also have maps that indicate to us where the environmental justice communities are. When I talk about environmental justice communities, I talk about historically Black and Brown neighborhoods. I talk about neighborhoods with limited English proficiency. We include tribal communities in our environmental justice communities and potentially underserved communities. Potentially underserved communities are those that have a high degree of poverty and a high degree of Black and Brown communities. We understand and we've heard that these maps are not as expansive as they could be, and that's why we're working with the Department of Health and Human Services to help us improve our mapping. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, thank you. This one. First question of the afternoon. I'm going to key it off here. So this is for you guys to chime in. What environmental justice factors should the Department of Environmental Quality consider in the department's analysis of the Clean Trucks Rule?
And if you would like to weigh in here, we ask that you use the raise your hand feature to indicate that you'd like to be unmuted, and we'll go ahead and let you unmute yourself. You can also go ahead and just type your response directly into the chat. If you're calling in through a phone line today and want to raise your hand, press *3.
Thanks, Sean.
And Robin, we have Paul Hirely raising his hand. So Paul, go ahead and unmute yourself. Go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, and actually live in North Carolina. I'm working a lot of freight issues, and we're doing some of the same work right now. What we look at when we do environmental justice analysis of freight studies is you sort of start with the freight hubs, like where are the freight hubs? You look at cities and counties throughout the state, and you find where are the major centers where the freight is stopping, like uh, you know, gassing facilities, warehousing, production facilities are typically clustered in certain areas. So it's useful to start with a hub analysis, find out where the hubs are first, and then identify the communities around the hubs. And what you normally find is there are a few key hubs in the state. It's not like you don't look at every city and every little area a freight truck goes. You look at the hubs and then kind of work backwards from there because freight, obviously, like cars, is everywhere and impacts everybody, but it's really those hubs where they're sitting idling when the most of the noise is and most of the air quality impacts are, that really centers on those communities.
Excellent. Thank you, Paul. Appreciate that. Do we have others want to chime in?
Jerry McCants has raised his hand. Jerry, go ahead and unmute yourself.
McCants, I'm in Greensboro, North Carolina. I heard you state that you're working with Health and Human Services, but have you considered talking with DOA and also the Department of HUB with minority businesses to talk about some of the strategies and initiatives that you are proposing on this WebinX today?
Yes, sir. That's an excellent suggestion. And we do work with the Department of Administration. Happy to talk to anyone else you recommend.
Tammy Hall is the Director of Historically Underutilized Businesses, and obviously Secretary Cashwell is DOA.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
You're welcome.
You have another response?
Robin, we have Patricio Portillo. Go ahead and unmute yourself, Patricio.
With the Natural Resources Defense Council. First of all, terrific presentation. I was kind of skimming through it. It's very thorough. I did want to just maybe pick up on a thread that Zach had mentioned earlier with respect to the complementary policies. I think it's clear that the Advanced Clean Trucks rule, it's a kind of critical foundational policy, but it doesn't do everything, right? It just requires sort of a minimum supply of zero emission vehicles coming to the state. So to ensure, and it doesn't say anything about kind of deployment and where those vehicles then must go. So I think this is probably more for a conversation of thinking about what are those additional policies that the state wants to pursue that can really target the deployment of the vehicles once they come to North Carolina into the communities that need them most, frankly. And there are a number of different ways in which that can be accomplished, both at the state and local regulatory levels, but also through targeted incentive programs and the like. But I also wanted to note that fleet reporting requirement piece of the Advanced Clean Trucks rule will also help shed a lot of light on the neighborhoods that these vehicles are being operated in, which can also help inform those sort of subsequent incentive programs or future regulatory actions.
Thank you, Patricio. That's an excellent suggestion and an excellent response. Sean, I think we maybe have time for one more, and then we'll move on.
Okay, Dusty Garland. Go ahead and unmute yourself, Dusty. He lowered his hand, so there you go. He raised his hand again. Sorry. Go ahead.
My name is Dusty Garland. I work for Peterbilt Motors. A quick thought on environmental justice would just be, grant programs to assist in those areas. We know from seeing in other states as they pass advanced clean trucks, what that really means is the OEMs have to really pay attention where trucks are going to be registered and ensure that the right percentage of our sales in those states are zero emission vehicles. And so especially if these regulations are intended to assist in adoption in environmental justice areas, it means more of the trucks will be there, which means trucks that are currently at a much higher price than diesel units will be there. And so for those owner operators or smaller fleets that are running in those areas, additional funding from the state is going to be absolutely necessary to keep from pricing them out of the business there, to adopt vehicles that are much newer and at a much newer technology than what most owner operators or small fleets are currently driving today.
Fabulous. Thank you, Dusty, for that recommendation and those thoughts. To be respectful of everyone's time, if you have additional thoughts about this particular question, you can put them in the chat. We will be following up after this webinar with thoughts about those. And again, we'll have another webinar this evening. If we go to the next slide, I believe I'm turning it over to my colleague, Randy Strait. Randy?
Thank you, Robin. I am Randy Strait. I'm with the Division of Air Quality within the Department of Environmental Quality. I'm Chief of the Planning Section. And I wanted to talk a little bit about our greenhouse gas inventory and forecast, which is an infographic summarizes the data that we've compiled for 2018. The bigger picture is that we produce this inventory and forecast every other year. This is from our report that we produced a year ago, this past January. And what we prepare the emissions for a historical period from 1990 up through the most recent year for which we have data. In this case, it was 2018 where we have data, historical data, that we can calculate emissions. And then we do a projection from 2018 out to 2030. So I wanted to just talk about the 2018 year emissions here a little bit. And what we learned from this work is that the transportation sector is accounting for nearly 36% of the statewide greenhouse gas emissions, and that's gross emissions. And that's followed by the power electric generation sector, and then the industrial and ag waste, and then residential and commercial sectors. Up until about 2015, 2016, the power sector was our leading source of greenhouse gas emissions. But because of reductions that have occurred in the power sector, emission reductions and programs implemented there, now we're looking at the transportation sector being our largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. Now we look at the emissions in two different ways. There's a gross, which includes our carbon, includes the carbon sinks. It's carbon that's stored by our forest and marshlands and whatnot. And then we have net emissions, which is looking at that actually accounts for that carbon storage. I said that incorrectly. The gross emissions is looking at statewide emissions. The net emissions accounts for the carbon sink. Sorry about that. But if you look in the lower right-hand corner of the infographic here, we have our net emissions have gone down by 30%, 23% from 2005 to 2018. So that's good progress, but we still have a lot of work to do. So next slide, please. This next slide is summarizing that 36% of the statewide emissions in 2018. This is breaking that down to show the different types of on-road vehicles, the different categories that are contributing to that 36%. So the green, the large green part of the pie here is these are the on-road light-duty gasoline vehicles and trucks, and that's 72% of the total. These vehicles, generally, they're federal standards, tailpipe standards, and fuel economy standards are doing a good job at cleaning up the emissions for those sectors. And then, of course, we have zero emission vehicle programs that are taking off in the state, as Zach alluded to earlier. But the medium and heavy duty vehicle sector is accounting for 17% of the total. 16% of that is associated with diesel vehicles and another 1% with gasoline vehicles. Next slide, please. One of the important reasons why we're focusing on the medium heavy duty vehicle sector is that it only represents about a little over 3% of North Carolina's on-road registered vehicles. But in addition to accounting for a significant amount of our greenhouse gas emissions, they're also a significant source of what we call the criteria pollutants. In 2017, they accounted for 32% of North Carolina's on-road fine particulate matter pollution and 26% of the on-road nitrogen oxide emissions, which is a precursor to ozone formation. Now, North Carolina is, we're happy to report that we're in statewide attainment with all of the national ambient air quality standards. That is the fine particulate standard, PM2.5, ozone, on all the other standards. However, EPA just proposed last month to lower the fine particulate standard, the annual standard, from 12 micrograms per cubic meter to a range of between 9 and 10. And we have, right now, we think if they set it at 9, we'd have one area in the Charlotte area that'd be real close to that, exceeding that standard. The other thing EPA is doing is they're reconsidering their review of the ozone standard, and if they decide to move forward with lowering that standard or revising it to lower the standard, we may have some concern with achieving these tighter standards. So what the medium heavy duty vehicle ZEV program and the ACT will help us do is continue to lower emissions to stay ahead of so that when these standards are lowered, we'll still be in attainment statewide with those standards. If an area is designated non-attainment, it creates a lot of work. We have to prepare plans to show how we're going to bring the area back into attainment, which means adopting additional control measures to reduce emissions. And and then the area is under a maintenance plan for 20 years, which can have the effect of suppressing economic growth in the area. So we're trying to avoid that going forward. So additional emission reductions will certainly help ensure ongoing compliance with the national ambient air quality standards as EPA looks to lower some of these standards in the future. Next slide, please. Okay, question. What are the greatest potential benefits to North Carolina that you see in adopting the Advanced Clean Truck Rule?
Again, please raise your hand or type in the chat. If you'd like to respond, to raise your hand from a dial-in, press *3. Randy, we have Ben Kessler, who would like to respond. Ben, if you can unmute yourself. Go ahead.
Everyone, good afternoon. Ben Kessler with ChargePoint. I think there are a lot of great benefits for the Advanced Clean Truck Rule for North Carolina, from air pollution reduction to operational cost reduction to the job opportunities to maintain these vehicles, but just also throwing out there consumer choice. Residents and businesses of North Carolina will have more choices out on the free market to procure vehicles for their operations that can meet their needs. So just also wanted to bring that attention, and thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Ben.
Next, we have Dana Thompson. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, thank you. Dana Thompson with the American Lung Association. Last year, we released a report called Delivering Clean Air, which highlighted the benefits of transitioning trucks to zero emission along the freight corridors. We found that North Carolina could experience significant public health benefits that include $19 billion in public health benefits by 2050, 1,700 lives saved, 45,000 asthma attacks avoided, and 225,000 lost workdays avoided due to cleaner air.
Okay, good. Thanks for pointing out your work there, Dana, in the report.
We have Patricio again. Go ahead and unmute.
Yeah, thank you. Patricio Portillo with NRDC again. I think similar to the first commenter, there's a lot of really great aspects and benefits associated with this regulation, particularly on the air pollutant and greenhouse gas emission reduction side. But I think one of the, more sort of fundamental points here that often gets overlooked is what this does for the market. So right now, we're in this period of very rapid change and dynamism in this industry that hasn't experienced this degree of change previously. It's also, it's a global market, so these manufacturers are playing in a lot of different parts of the world and are responding to regulatory pressures from Europe and parts of Asia as well. And because of this sort of dynamism, there's also a degree of uncertainty and risk that's associated with it. And what this standard does is it provides kind of like that base level of this is kind of roughly the number of vehicles that you're going to be having coming to your state over this period of time. And that degree of certainty can be really helpful for attracting additional investments, injecting that sort of market certainty into your state that will help unlock, additional infrastructure investments, momentum to address some of the infrastructure related concerns, as well as just in general, like the EV ecosystem that's being kind of built up in North Carolina. So I think that market certainty point is a really sort of helpful and important benefit that's associated with this regulation.
Okay, thank you, Patricio.
And next we have Tom Van Heek. Go ahead and unmute.
Hey there, I'm on a phone, so hopefully this all worked and you can hear me.
We can hear you great.
Great. Yeah, Tom Van Heek, Senior Policy Advisor at Rivian Automotive. We're a manufacturer of medium and heavy duty zero emission trucks and vans, including a delivery van for Amazon that hopefully you'll all see in your neighborhoods soon. I don't think I could put things much better than Patricio just did, but just to put a finer point on it from the perspective of the manufacturer of these vehicles, one of the benefits we see of the ACT rule and one of the reasons we support it is it does drive investment into the manufacturing side of this industry. And that's key for, well, principally because it helps to scale production and move the whole industry down the cost curve as quickly as possible. If we want to see these vehicles come down in price, grow the volume that's available for sale on the market, we have to drive investment into the industry on the manufacturing side. And this rule is a key driving force in doing that. And that's going to be to the benefit of both fleet operators who buy the vehicles, consumers who breathe the air around the vehicles when they operate, as well as companies that build them in the first place and sell them. So just wanted to sort of add a +1 to the comments we've heard so far and add a manufacturer voice. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Tom. That's a good comment.
Dana Thompson may have re-raised her hand. Dana, did you have a follow-up or?
No, my apologies. I didn't remove it.
No worries. I think that's all the comments we have, Randy.
Okay. Well, I think we have another question. Next slide, please. Here we go. What does the adoption of the Advanced Clean Trucks rule mean to you and your community or organization?
We have Dana Thompson again. Go ahead and unmute, Dana.
Thank you and appreciate the opportunity to speak again. The Lung Association has issued a letter last year encouraging the adoption of the Advanced Clean Trucks standard in North Carolina as an important public health and health equity measure. We participated in the opening workshop on these policies and very much appreciated the focus on the incredible pollution reduction opportunity that cleaning up trucking represents. The American Lung Association's State of the Air Report 2022 noted that over 1.1 million North Carolina residents face unhealthy levels of ozone pollution, including nearly 100,000 children and adults living with asthma. Breathing unhealthy air can cause serious health consequences, including asthma attacks, increased risk of respiratory infection, heart attacks and strokes, lung cancer, and premature death. Children, older adults, people with heart and lung illnesses, lower income residents, and people of color face increased risks due to poor air quality. We know that while diesel trucks make up only a small portion of mobile sources, they generate a significant share of ozone and particle-forming nitrogen oxides and are a primary contributor to carcinogenic diesel exhaust. Too many communities, including communities of color and lower income communities, face increased risks due to high concentrations of toxic truck emissions nearby highways, warehouses, rail yards, and other diesel hotspots. We also recognize that these conditions place a greater inequitable burden on our most vulnerable and disadvantaged communities. We also call for increasing equitable distribution of benefits through targeted investment in incentives, charging, and other complementary policies to ensure rapid deployment of clean technologies in heavy impacted communities. Thank you for your consideration of the ACT rule as a critical health intervention to save lives, prevent tens of thousands of asthma attacks and lost work days by delivering cleaner air to all communities. The Lung Association and our health partners put a high priority on these policies and would be happy to follow up in writing.
Very good. Thank you, Dana.
Next, Olivia Campbell Anderson. Olivia may have lowered her hand. Olivia, if you still have a comment, go ahead and unmute yourself. Olivia, I've requested that you unmute. If you could press, Olivia might be having some trouble. We'll come back to Olivia. Again, if you're on a phone, press *6 to mute and unmute yourself. But we'll come back to Olivia. Ben Kessler again, go ahead and unmute.
Yeah, thanks again for the opportunity. Ben Kessler from ChargePoint. Personally, I think advanced clean trucks means a lot to me as, someone who experienced childhood asthma due to environmental factors where I lived. Personally, to me, it means a lot to breathe cleaner air. But certainly as an organization for ChargePoint, I think other commenters had mentioned it gives, certainty for investments. And certainly, ChargePoint is involved in fleet infrastructure, electric vehicle infrastructure. So it gives us certainty to invest resources in the state through workforce, but also equipment and whatever comes down the road from that. So certainly appreciate the opportunity again to talk.
Yes, thank you, Ben.
And we have a comment from Paul Hireling again.
Yeah, thank you. I think the clean air and the clean energy advocates have really covered that part of it. But EO 271 doesn't really look like it assures that clean energy trucks or zero emissions trucks produced in North Carolina will be used in North Carolina. So, my understanding of the rating is that you can advance production, but this doesn't necessarily mean these vehicles will be used specifically on North Carolina roads, especially with California's move to make all heavy duty trucks zero emissions shortly. So, we could be looking at a market that's catering to another state, right? So I think it's going to be important when you're implementing this executive order to, include some policies that assure that the trucks will be used locally. I think public fleets can be an important target for that. The state has its own medium duty trucks. And I think there could be some room there to help create market for local consumption. And otherwise, I think you need to really think about, how do we synergize this with other existing state laws, or, how do we synergize this with maybe future legislation that helps encourage the use of ZEVs for medium and heavy duty truck usage. The other issue, of course, everyone talks about is the range issues. There needs to be, I think, some focus on hydrogen for the heavy duty vehicles. Electric, totally feasible for medium duty. But hydrogen, I think, is what you'll find the industry folks are going to be pushing for long haul, because long haul just isn't going to make it on electric. Long haul still needs hydrogen while that electric technology is developed to get those longer trips in on electric battery. So just a couple of things to help, make sure that this executive order actually results in the emissions reductions and the healthcare impacts that we want to see.
Okay, good. Thank you, Paul.
And Olivia, we're going to try Olivia again. Can you unmute yourself now, Olivia? There you go.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, great.
Mhm.
Well, my name is Olivia Campbell with ABB E-Mobility. We're the world's largest EV charging manufacturer and electrical gear company. I think echoing Ben's points around certainty, that we're going through an incredible global transition here with transportation electrification, zero emission vehicles. Without some certainty, it makes it much more difficult to make investments in manufacturing. It makes it much more difficult even for utilities to do the planning work to get the grid ready, and for regulators to improve those public investments. And so the opportunity for certainty as to understanding where the market's going is incredibly valuable to us as a company. And for us, it of course means jobs. So jobs in North Carolina, where we have several manufacturing facilities and a home base for us on our education division. But it means economic opportunity, as well as reducing fueling costs for our customers, which ultimately reduces the cost of transporting goods around the state.
Mhm. Okay, good. Thank you, Olivia.
And Randy, I think we have time for one more. So Katie Kawchak, go ahead and unmute.
I'm with Volvo Group North America. We are proud to be a North Carolina manufacturer of, to call North Carolina home. We've got about 2,500 employees in the state, with North America headquarters in Greensboro, a parts distribution facility in Advance, and a remanufacturing facility in Charlotte. And so, as a manufacturer in this state, and a manufacturer of Class 8 electric trucks and buses and construction equipment, we're really excited about initiatives to scale the deployment of zero emission vehicles. However, we're concerned about some of the things, some of the components that are outside of the control of manufacturers in zero emission vehicle electrification. And one of the biggest concerns we have is what happens if the charging infrastructure that's required to fuel these vehicles isn't ready when we have kind of the mandated percentages in years 1, 2, 3, 4. And so, we're concerned that we're going to be forced to sell a product that our customers might not be ready for or able to purchase because they don't have charging infrastructure available to them, or they're waiting to get their utility upgrade before they can get their charging infrastructure online. And so while there's a clear market signal, there's also a lot of uncertainty for the manufacturer who's kind of on the line here and responsible for meeting these goals. And so we have some pretty significant concerns along the lines of the things that are outside of our control.
Okay, thank you, Katie. All right. Sean, are we ready to move forward?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I think we have. The next slide, please. Another question. What changes do you envision ACT would bring to your business or your community? A little bit different question from the previous one.
Dusty Garland has a comment. Go ahead and unmute.
Thank you very much. Dusty Garland from Peterbilt, and I appreciate the chance to make a comment here and maybe ask a question as well. So somebody previously had asked about, making sure that the communities there in North Carolina experience the benefit of the zero emission vehicles. One of the things, we talk to a whole lot of fleets about this, and one of the things that they bring up often with Advanced Clean Truck in other states is, well, we register our trucks outside that state anyway, we'll just continue to do so, and it won't affect us as far as needing to purchase zero emission or having to buy from an OEM with requirements there. So I guess I would ask, is there a plan around advanced clean fleet adoption or something that would, because I see to answer this question, which is how it would impact the business or community in North Carolina, I think there's a chance it would just result in more trucks registered out of state or people driving older vehicles. Is there something outside of registration to keep clean vehicles there?
Dusty, this is Randy, and Zach, I don't know if you want to jump in, but at this point, the focus is on adopting the ACT, but we are certainly evaluating, what California is doing with their advanced clean fleets program. And but we're also, as Zach indicated, through a lot of different initiatives, planning to, kind of set or support development of the infrastructure to ensure that the manufacturers can meet those sales targets. Zach, you want to elaborate on that at all?
Sure. Thanks, Randy. Yeah, I would agree on the point that right now the focus really is advanced clean trucks and doing that in a way, moving that forward. But to the broader point about how do we ensure that these communities, these newer trucks stay in North Carolina, and B, they are prioritizing the communities that need them most. I think that's where many of the complementary strategies come in. You look at some of the federal programs that we are either benefiting from through formula or can compete for, is going to provide opportunity to build out that charging network, to think about rebates and other incentives to buy down the upfront cost of these vehicles. And through those programs, I think we'll have an opportunity to make sure that they're being deployed in the communities where the benefits will be the greatest. So just to reiterate, the advanced clean trucks rule is not a requirement on any purchasers of the vehicles. It really is just the sales requirement. But when it comes to those complementary strategies, we think we have a big opportunity to make sure that the market in North Carolina is ready to support the vehicles.
Right. Thank you, Zach. Thank you, Dusty. Appreciate the comment.
No other commenters right now in the
Okay.
or Spanish chat, so we can move on, Randy.
Okay, next slide, please. Okay, I'm gonna spare you a few questions here and go back to some slides about the what we have to do as a state in North Carolina, so kind of the procedures we need to follow to adopt the Advanced Clean Truck California's ACT program. Next slide, please. So there's the Clean Air Act provisions and there's Section 209 of the Clean Air Act, which gives California is the only state where they can, under Section 209, request of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency a grant for a waiver to implement vehicle emission standards that are unique, not less stringent than the federal standards. In other words, more stringent standards than the federal government or the federal standards. And then the for the ACT, EPA, California submitted a waiver request to EPA, and EPA took that out to comment last summer. And EPA, to be clear, has not yet approved the waiver request. They've also, but we're expecting that to happen sometime this year. States other than California can actually adopt the California standards once California receives a waiver approval from EPA for the more stringent state standard. The other states can adopt those California standards under Section 177 of the Clean Air Act. And those states do not need to, they're not required to seek EPA approval. Since EPA has already approved the California standard, other states can adopt it under 177, Section 177 of the Clean Air Act. There has been some precedent with North Carolina in around 2001, I believe. The Environmental Management Commission actually adopted a California vehicle emission standard for heavy-duty diesel engines, and this had to do with kind of a situation where EPA issued a federal rule, but there were some issues that California, and they'd already also approved a California waiver for the same group of vehicles, but there were some differences in the emissions testing requirements. California petitioned EPA, and there was a delay in getting the federal rule implemented. In the meantime, states like North Carolina were including that rule as part of their state implementation plan to reduce NOx emissions. So the EMC went ahead and adopted the California rule until the federal rule got straightened out and could be implemented. Okay, next slide, please. This is the language from Section 177 of the Clean Air Act, and I'm not going to read it, but there's some bold-faced or highlighted text here that really identify 4 principles that we need to address or as we're adopting the California standards under Section 177 of the Clean Air Act, and I'll cover those in the next slide, please. So one of those principles is applicability. So Section 177 of the Clean Air Act only provides authority to states with non-attainment plan provisions approved by EPA. So we do have some non-attainment plans for ozone for the Charlotte area. This previous ozone stands for Charlotte, Rocky Mount, Triangle area, Great Smoky Mountains National Park. And so we have those are maintenance areas for previous ozone standards for which we have these plans. So we meet that requirement. The second principle is called identicality. So when we're adopting a California standard, we have to basically accept that rule as is. They have to be identical to what the California standards are, for which the waiver has been granted for by EPA. Another requirement is that Section 177 of the Clean Air Act requires a state that adopts a California standard to wait 2 years before they can implement that standard. And the purpose of that is allow manufacturers time to adjust and get prepared for manufactured vehicles that comply with the standards that in the adopting state. So EPA defines a year as starting with January 2nd, so it's a calendar year. For the purpose of meeting this requirement under Section 177 of the Clean Air Act. And then the fourth principle is that this is kind of getting back to the identicality principle where the standards, we have to adopt them as is and kind of pull out the standards over for the full group of vehicles in the case of ACT. And we can't do something that would create like a third type of vehicle or third type of engine. They got to be pretty identical to what is in the California rule. Next slide, please. So these are for North Carolina in terms of adopting the rule. We're anticipating that we'll have, the goal is to have a rule that's effective by January 1, 2024. And this is the, Robin had covered these sales targets that are in the California rule. So the model year is on the of the vehicle that it would start with. These sales targets is on the left-hand side of the chart here. So we have to, if we adopt the rule and it's effective January 1, 2024, and we wait 2 years, that puts us at January 1, 2026. The model years come out in the fall of the year, of the calendar year, or January. So we'd really be starting with model year 2027 vehicles. So, and we would enter the sales target schedule here for the percentages that are associated with the model year 2027. Because of the identicality principle, we couldn't like roll those sales targets for model year 2027 and say, let's start at the first year at 5, 9, and 5% for the different categories of vehicles here. Okay, next slide, please. We have, in addition to California, 6 other states have adopted ACT, and this slide is just showing those states: Oregon, Washington, New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, and Vermont. And it shows the model year vehicle that they're starting with in their rule. Vermont actually just adopted their rule at the end of last year. So, next slide, please. Okay, next question. What are the biggest challenges to meeting the sales targets for medium heavy duty zero emission vehicles?
Randy, while we wait for folks to raise their hands, I'll just note that a comment came through in the chat during your slides from Jerry McCants, who asks, how much money does the state of NC expect to receive from the federal government for this issue? And what are the timelines for adopting legislation in NC? I don't know if you have wanted to respond to that.
Randy, do you want me to?
Yeah, Zach, go ahead.
So to answer one half of the question, I would just say we don't, as part of Executive Order 271 and the Advanced Clean Trucks Rule, we don't anticipate new legislation being needed or planned on, at least from our perspective. In terms of federal funding, we could spend the rest of the webinar discussing the sources of federal funding, maybe just to provide a high-level answer. North Carolina is already receiving hundreds of millions of dollars that will support the transition to zero-emission vehicles, and that certainly right now is focused on the light-duty side. I don't want to mischaracterize that, but we will have the opportunity to compete for billions of dollars in additional funds that can support this work. And so the 2 federal pieces of legislation that are top of the list include the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act. Through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, we are already in the process of deploying funding through the NEVI program for charging infrastructure. There are other programs that are supporting the transition to zero-emission school buses and transit buses through the Federal Department of Transportation. And there are a number of programs in the Inflation Reduction Act that I won't get into detail, but that we are looking closely at specifically to support implementation of this executive order. And some of that work and those opportunities will be outlined in the Clean Transportation Plan. So lots of different programs and policies, but we have resources online and are always happy to follow up with more specific programs.
We have a comment. The first hand up was Tim French. Tim, go ahead and unmute. Tim, are you able to unmute yourself? *6 on phone. There you go.
Hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. My name is Tim French, and I'm with the Truck and Engine Manufacturers Association. We're the association of manufacturers of most all leading medium-duty and heavy truck manufacturers in the United States. And we've been active participants in the crafting and adoption of the underlying California ACT rule. And I'll say up front, we fully support the transition of this market to ZEVs. It will happen, it should happen. It's just a question of how and when it happens. So we share the goal. The problem is, and we've said this in all kinds of forums to very limited success, I'll admit, the problem is programs like ACT, which we term sort of naked sales mandates, they're just sales mandates without more. Those kinds of programs, while directionally correct, are not, they're just not teed up for success. To get ZEV trucks out the door, in place, there's so many things that are outside of the OEM's control that all need to be phased in on the same timeline as the ZEV sales mandate. People won't buy, for example, a ZEV truck, which currently costs 2 to 3 times more than a conventionally fueled truck, probably without incentives. And those incentives probably need to be on the order of $125,000 or so per truck, at least now. And those are the kinds of incentives that are being made available out in California. The ZEV infrastructure for heavy-duty vehicles and medium-duty vehicles, as someone else pointed out, not only needs to account for battery recharging, and it needs to be fast charging, but also needs to account for hydrogen refueling, because yes, Class 8 vehicles probably are going to go to hydrogen, either fuel cells or in some cases, ICE engines burning hydrogen. So there's really 2 infrastructures that need to be taken into account. A lot of studies looking at this point out that for heavy-duty vehicles and large medium-duty vehicles, the ratio of trucks to charging stations needs to be about 1 to 1. It might get to like 1.5 to 1, but it's a lot. It's a lot of charging stations. So if you project out how many truck sales you're talking about, you're going to need that many chargers, both at depots, public sites, and these chargers need to be at a minimum kilowatts for these kinds of vehicles. If it's a station where these things are accumulating, you know, you might even need a new separate electrical installation. Some of those installations, as you know, if you talk to your utility commission, can be, you know, 5 years lead time to get the connections set up, these substations set up that are needed to serve 1 megawatt facility. So it's not to say that these things can't be done, but they're outside of the OEM's control. And so it's really a 3-legged stool from our perspective. It's sure, make sure there's truck availability, but then you've got to make sure people are going to buy the trucks. And then you've got to make sure that the infrastructure is in place. What North Carolina is talking about, I think, is starting in model year 2027, you're going to jump in and mandate 15 to 20% of all vehicle sales have to be ZEVs. Are you really highly confident that all of the other pieces to do that will be in place by then, that you'll have robust incentive programs, that fleets will actually show up in California and buy, that everybody that wants it can fully operate these vehicles and not have uncertainty about access to ZEVs? Recall also that, you know, batteries these days are pretty big and heavy for some of these applications. So in some instances, if I'm operating a fleet and I have 4 conventionally fueled vehicles, I might need 5 ZEVs to do that same amount of work because I'm going to lose some payload, et cetera. So some applications also where it might not work. Long story short, if North Carolina is serious, your programs need to include off-ramps. You need to establishing objective benchmarks about incentive programs in the state, about ZEV infrastructure readiness in the state, such that if you're not hitting those benchmarks for these two legs of the stool that are outside of the OEM's control, that you're not going to strictly adhere to this requirement for 15 to 20% kicking off in 2027. Because if you don't, and if manufacturers can't make those sales, and as we sit here today, not to rain on everybody's parade, from where we sit today, in North Carolina, you're probably unlikely to be able to assure that. If manufacturers can't make those sales because people aren't around to purchase, because there's no incentives, their infrastructure's lagging behind, there's lead times for all these grid integrations, et cetera. If OEMs can't make those electric sales, similarly, they're not going to be able to sell the same volume of conventionally fueled vehicles without either incurring massive fines or having to buy credits. It'll become untenable. And what that really means, ironically, is that the turnover of your heavy duty fleet in North Carolina, if you don't do this right, is going to stall out. So we will have a direct opposite result of what we're looking for. And while, we do know under the Infrastructure Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, there's a lot of money. I think we heard that even in your initial NEVI programs, National Electric Vehicle programs that you're working on with those funds, 95% of it is dedicated to light duty. I mean, right? The governor wants 1 million point something light duty vehicles on the road. So all of those initial monies, we can all admit amongst ourselves that's going to light duty. So these problems are not trivial. And we're not here to say, let's not do this, but you got to do it intelligently. And I'm not trying to be patronizing. And the best way to do that is make sure you build in off-ramps. Because if you don't, this thing's going to start to collapse. We might see it start to collapse in California first. That little domino effect could trickle to the other opt-in states. You've got to be careful. I would also, last thing, point out that EPA has just finalized a low NOx rule for these same vehicles that starts in 2027. That will address a lot of criteria pollutant concerns going forward. I would also point out that EPA is going to propose a phase 3 greenhouse gas rule in March. They're going to finalize that by the end of the year. It will have baked into it ZEV deployment targets that will drive lower and lower and lower greenhouse gas limits that manufacturers need to meet. The only way to do that will be an increasing percentage of ZEV. So there are federal programs that are coming. We would suggest those are probably better ways to go for the state. But anyway, we want to keep up this dialogue because there's a lot of room for error here. And I urge you to keep talking with us because otherwise I fear that all of these well-intentioned efforts are not going to work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, appreciate your comments, Tim. We hear you. I think we need to move on to stay on schedule here. Sean, you want to?
Yes, next we have Ben Kessler again. Go ahead and unmute yourself, Ben.
Yeah, appreciate the opportunity, and I'll try to be brief here. I really appreciated what Zach had mentioned, how the executive offices are looking at other ways to utilize funding that's coming down. I think that's really important because a lot of the grant programs that we have seen have not funded behind the gate infrastructure where we know trucks are dwelling and doing most of their operations and where it'd be easiest to charge. So certainly, finding success in this program would be finding, ways to allow behind the gate charging. And then Olivia had mentioned utility proactiveness, and certainly the previous speaker had mentioned, right, as one of the legs of the stool that needs to be done is there needs to be work for utilities to have staff and understanding of where upgrades on the distribution network need to happen in these facilities to allow for these EV chargers. And then just lastly is, right to charge, especially for commercial properties, is, sometimes these facilities are not owned by the fleet operators who are running trucks in their facilities. And so it may be hard to install charging equipment, the landlord go through the easement process and getting all the permits. And so that presents a significant issue for the deployment of chargers. And so that might take more of a legislative than a regulatory action, but certainly wanted to flag it. But we went to the moon in 7 years. I think we could probably accomplish this in a shorter amount of time, and certainly look forward to working with the state on overcoming these challenges. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ben.
We have Patricio again.
Hey, Patricio Portillo with NRDC again. I kind of wanted to pick up on, some of the concerns that Tim raised in one of the questions in the chat. I think this points to one of the, largest problems, facing the staff and the state, which is just the lack of knowledge and understanding of what vehicle and infrastructure incentives are available in North Carolina, both state and federal incentives. And I think Zach started rattling off, a really great list, and his point being that we could spend the rest of this webinar just fixating on or just talking about, what is available, but it kind of speaks to, a need for additional stakeholder education, saying, sharing like, yes, you are eligible for this $40,000 federal tax incentive, for example, for, a new zero emission Class 8 truck. Just kind of doing that, that educational outreach. It also kind of speaks to, I think, a fundamental misunderstanding of what the standards actually are proposing and how they function, which is it's based on a credit and deficit system that inherently includes a great deal of flexibility, which will allow, particularly in the near term, manufacturers to trade and exchange credits if they're unable to actually produce or sell the vehicles, which really just includes, a great deal of flexibility that will help with compliance in the near term for this regulation. I'm also kind of curious. I know we have Volvo and Rivian on here, but I'm curious what they think of Tim's characterization of their ability to sell zero emission vehicles. These are companies that are making substantial investments and plans to sell these zero emission vehicles, as we heard from Volvo, well before 2027. So I think there's a bit of a disconnect there, and I'd be curious to hear if they have any thoughts on that.
Randy, there are no other hands raised right
Yeah.
now. I will just
Okay.
note, there was a question in the chat asking if you could explain why we are proposing the annual zero emission medium and heavy duty production numbers that were shown on the slide. I know those percentages are really important. Do you just want to explain where those numbers come from again?
They come from the California Advanced Clean Truck Rule. And I'm looking for the chat question here to make sure I understand it.
That's right, Randy.
Yeah.
The
Yeah,
question
that's
is, can we explain why we're
Mhm.
proposing those particular production numbers? And those come straight from the Advanced Clean Trucks Rule, which we cannot change.
Yeah, that's right. And one thing I didn't really go into detail when I was talking about the rule, and Patricio alluded to it or talked about it a little bit, but the California rule does provide manufacturers 3 years prior to when they have to meet the sales targets for a model year. For example, California's rule starts with model year 2024, so they can accumulate they have this credit deficit system where they can they calculate their deficits, and then they have to sell zero emission vehicles to an ultimate purchaser of that vehicle to earn credits. And at the end of the year, then their credits have to equal their deficits, is what the purpose of that is. But prior to 2024, starting with 2021 under the California rule, it allows the manufacturers to generate credits that can be applied to the deficits starting with model year 24. I think those credits in those early years end by 2030, but they can then trade those credits back and forth for within the state of California. So we'd be adopting a similar approach here. By adopting ACT, we'd be doing a similar thing here in North Carolina. So manufacturers would start with, could start accumulating credits in 2024 for model year 2024 to help comply with the sales targets in 2027.
And there were a couple other comments that just came in through the chat.
Okay.
Keith Larrick asks, just to be clear, the options are a carbon copy of the California rule or nothing. And that would be correct. Is that right, Randy?
Yeah, yep. As far as the sales targets go, yes.
And Paul Hirling just has a comment. I highly recommend NCDEQ hire one of the leading freight consultants, such as Cambridge Systematics, to assist in identifying the charging network needs, origin destination flows, industry needs, and policy recommendations. The amount of technical data needs to inform this decision are substantial.
And I can just provide a brief response to that. In terms of the charging needs, I would direct you to, I'm forgetting the exact section, but one of the sections in EO 271 that calls for a charging and fueling infrastructure needs assessment. That's going to be conducted by our Department of Transportation, and certainly timely to provide feedback on the nature and scope of that analysis. For the broader recommendations and policy considerations, I would just point back to the Clean Transportation Plan process, which is leaning on the MOU work that I discussed that's been took place for over a year, and the action plan that came out of that process. So that's not the end of the work, but a really good starting point for North Carolina to think through some of the next steps from a policy and strategic planning standpoint.
Okay, thank you, Zach.
We can move on
Yeah.
just for time, Randy.
What does North Carolina need to do to support a successful transition to zero emission medium heavy duty vehicles in our state? I think some of the comments we've already received have touched on this, but others want to.
Tim French has his hand raised again. Tim, do you have a comment?
Yeah, real briefly. The biggest thing you need to consider is providing off-ramps that allow for additional flexibility if benchmarks about available incentives, purchase orders, and infrastructure aren't in keeping with the 15-20% penetration rates you're mandating. I would just note a couple things out of earlier comments. First, I think it'd be instructive if you all went and determined how many credits have been generated in California thus far. I think you'll be informed by that, and then assume, if that's what's going on in California, what would be going on in North Carolina. Second of all, the reference to the tax credit, that's probably enough to cover the 12% federal excise tax on a ZEV, which again is 2 to 3 times higher than a conventionally fueled truck. That's not going to make the difference for a fleet operator. Again, your incentives need to be more in the neighborhood of $125,000 or $150,000, probably, at least in these initial years. It's not a question of what OEMs can build. manufacturers like Volvo have the capability to build quite a few ZEBs and applications. It's what are they going to be able to sell, right? So it's off ramps. If you don't take that recommendation seriously, sure that this policy, well intended as it is, could trip. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you, Tim.
And
Go ahead.
Patricio in the chat just had a comment that the Memorandum of Understanding Action Plan is terrific and examines many of the concerns raised, and provides a link in the chat to that plan. And if we have time for one more comment, we have Ben Kessler again. Go ahead and unmute, Ben.
Appreciate the opportunity to speak again. Sorry for speaking so much. But I think one of the previous commenters talked about education as being a real important thing too. There's the federal tax credit now available for commercial vehicles, the 45W, which is, I think, a $40,000 tax credit. And as we talk about, 2027, vehicle costs will be coming down surely as these options become more expanding. So hopefully we don't need those levels of incentives to get out there. But, education is an important thing. I think the coordination between the utilities, as we talked about before, and the agencies that are doing this work, this is not going to be in silos, right? Which I really appreciate. The government of North Carolina working across agencies here. And then the implementation side as well, I think is important. And certainly going back to how do we make it easy for fleets to go through a streamlined process, understand their rates with the utility to deploy, and get hooked up with a contractor, which all goes back to education on how they do this. So appreciate the opportunity. Thanks.
Yep. Thank you, Ben.
That's all we have, Randy.
Okay, next slide. What are some potential challenges that the Department of Environmental Quality may face in developing the Advanced Clean Trucks rule? I think we may have already heard some, or quite a few.
Dusty Garland has his hand raised again. Go ahead and unmute.
Hey, Dusty Garland, thanks again for the opportunity to speak. I think Tim does bring up some good points there. That is true. As far as challenges, what we've seen in California is the $40,000 tax credit will about make up for FET, but because of California sales tax, that amount's made up for on the other side, because it's often another 9% there. So it's absolutely right. It's going to take grant funding to a substantial amount, $120,000, $150,000, which then requires people to register in the state and helps meet advanced clean truck rules. The challenge is going to be that if those incentives are not there, I think a lot of fleets who need to make sure that they remain profitable and above water are going to simply drive diesels and register them out of state. So it'll be, how do we incentivize people to register trucks in North Carolina, knowing that that means they'll have to purchase some zero emissions? Because I understand it's not a purchase requirement, it's a sales requirement, but it takes both sides for a transaction. So it'll be incentivizing people to really register it there and drive zero emissions in North Carolina.
Okay, thank you, Dusty.
At the moment, we don't see any other hands raised and we don't see any additional comments, so you can proceed.
Okay. And I think I turn this back over to my colleague, Robin.
Thanks, Randy. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
I'm going to, in the last minutes of our webinar, go through our next steps and our next opportunities for input. Next slide. So our tentative rulemaking timeline is the rulemaking concept was already developed and drafted and given to the or presented to the AQC. That's just the concept. We do have to draft the fiscal note, which is in May of 2023. Then we will move forward in a very stepwise fashion, as we always do when rulemaking occurs. through the end of this year and hopefully have a potential effective date in January of 2024. I would like to point out that we will have another opportunity for engagement and for everyone to participate over the summer when we have our public hearings. Next slide, please. I'm going to go ahead and handle this one, Randy, just for sake of time. So
Okay, go ahead.
we have to develop a fiscal note, and a fiscal note is the regulatory impact statement that other states call. And this fiscal note needs to include a summary of the costs and benefits. These costs and benefits are the cost to the manufacturers, potential fuel costs, infrastructure, maintenance, midlife costs, and other costs, and the benefits that we will be reviewing and including in our fiscal note include some of the avoided premature deaths, avoided hospitalizations for cardiovascular illnesses, avoided hospitalizations for respiratory illnesses, and avoided emergency room visits. These fiscal notes take a fair amount of time to put together, and we are in process of gathering all these data now. Next slide. So our next steps, we're almost at the end of these next steps, but our next step is to include continuing the conversation with everyone. Just because we've had this initial conversation with folks, we want to make sure that we stay engaged and that we continue to keep you guys apprised of what we're doing and how we're doing it. Next step. Next slide. Our outreach timeline. We're here at this webinar this afternoon and again this evening. If you want to join us again, we're happy to have you. You will have to register. We will have a final stakeholder webinar on the 21st of February. And that's where we're going to come back to the table and let you guys know all of the different things we've heard, let you guys know what our next steps, our continuing next steps are, and possible meetings for engagement and things like that. Next slide, please. We have a couple more last minute questions. How can the Department of Environmental Quality improve our engagement with the stakeholders, including the environmental justice communities during this process?
Before I turn to the folks raising their hands, I'll just read aloud a couple of comments in the chat. First, Tom Van Heek says that Patricio had asked for Rivian's perspective. What I can share is that Rivian is working hard to ramp up production of our portfolio as quickly as possible to meet strong market demand. Our medium-duty vehicles are already at work for fleets across the country, from Amazon to fire departments to utilities, paving contractors. And Blanca Patrick notes that the Memorandum of Understanding Action Plan recommends that states adopt advanced clean fleets regulation requiring EV purchases, not just sales. Is that under consideration in North Carolina?
Sean, I'll answer that one. We've already addressed that, and the Memorandum of Understanding Action Plan that was put together is it's a menu of things that states can adopt and that states can do. It's not a panacea for all the states. And we were involved, North Carolina was involved in the development of that plan as it was going on.
Thanks, Robin. And Dusty Garland has raised his hand to respond to the question on the screen about improving outreach. Dusty, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thanks so much, and thanks for the opportunity again. So one of the ways I think you improve in outreach, especially to environmental justice areas, would be, I've heard other states, a lot of times when they talk to communities, they will have fiscal studies and use things like cost parity, especially once grant funding is out, to say, with this grant funding, we're at cost parity for a diesel. And I just always ask that, those doing those studies keep in mind the age of the fleets that are in their communities. And so often the number that's being referred to is cost parity with a brand new diesel. But I would venture to say that especially in a lot of environmental justice areas, they are not brand new diesels that are being operated. And so just keeping in mind that when we say cost parity, is the average age of the fleets in those areas 2015? Is it 2012, 2014? But whatever it is, what is the average cost of those vehicles on the market? And then what is the average cost you're finding for the electric vehicle operation, and calculating cost parity in that way, as opposed to just new to new, since that's not always the case in those areas.
Thank you, Dusty. That's an excellent point. Next question. Response?
No other hands raised right now. If you are calling in, reminder, it's *3 to raise your hand. Another comment in the chat from Paul Hirely. NCDEQ putting together a truck manufacturer's industry stakeholder group would greatly benefit your engagement process.
Thank you, Paul. That is something that we are talking with, and Zach and I are putting our heads together on how to make that happen. Thank you. If you don't have any other questions, we can move on to the next slide. What other topics should the Department of Environmental Quality consider in the development of the Advanced Clean Trucks program that were not covered in our presentations today? I've heard a fair amount of other things, but here's your last chance.
Patricio has raised his hand. Go ahead and unmute.
I think I mean, I'm sure you all have already started looking at this or projecting it out, but I do think it would be helpful to kind of put into context what the actual numbers of vehicles we're talking about, particularly in those early years. So just showing a chart of well, in 2027, we can expect, X number of zero emission to be trucks that would need to be sold. Because I think a lot of the concerns that are raised are about 100% transition and the assumption that this big wave of zero emission vehicles are going to be coming, when in reality it's it's a much smaller volume. So I think that might just sort of help drive home that point if you had a little chart or something like that to kind of go alongside the percentages from the ACT rule.
Excellent. Thank you, Tricio. See if I can gin one up for our wrap-up meeting on the 21st.
Well, this is Randy. Sounds like a simple task, but it's not. We are working on those numbers, actually, Patricio. So I'm not sure we'll have them ready by the 21st, but we have different sets of data that we're looking at, and we need to figure out the best set of data. So, but yes, I agree with you. Anticipated that might be a question, and we've been working on it. So, thank you.
Another hand from Sarav. Go ahead and unmute, Sarav.
University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Very nice presentation. Thanks to all the speakers for the talks. I was looking for one specific information on the air quality benefits from ACT to see what the benefits may be at local scales next to the highways where these emissions are going to be reduced. If there is some other document where this is already available, that'll be great for me, or maybe there's something that can be covered in future talks.
That will be something that is covered in future talks, and it will be part of our fiscal note that will be developed. I can tell you what the air quality looks like now. That's where we are.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, this is Randy. I might elaborate a little bit. For the fiscal note, we have a pretty short time frame to get this done, and so it will be a statewide analysis. It will not be looking at impacts on local communities, to be clear. However, and it's a different kind of modeling that needs to be done to look at the impact on local communities. And I think there are some, there may be some work being currently underway looking at that. We're kind of following that. Can't give you more details, but anyway, if I understand you correct, what you'd like to know is what those emission reductions would look like at a, let's say, at a census block sub-county level, and what are the corresponding benefits, health benefits from that reduction. Is that correct?
Exactly, Randy. That's exactly what I'm
Yeah.
looking for. But
And
it sounds like you're saying that that will not be available.
not from our fiscal net analysis to support the advanced clean trucks rule, because it's detailed modeling that it's using a different kind of mobile model. And it's something that we will not be able to get done in time for the fiscal note. But there is work going on in that arena to look at that, and we're tracking it, and hope to be able to do some more of that, more targeted work, looking at local community impacts going forward.
Okay, that's really where I think we'll see a lot of benefits.
Yeah.
I see a lot of discussion on EJ, and that really
Yeah.
applies to local communities. And I hear you on the timelines available for you to get this out, but I think that's where some of the emphasis may be in actually demonstrating benefits of ACT.
Yeah, understood. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Evan. Thank you, Brandy. We're going to have to move on. We're about running out of time. Next slide. So just to bring it all back home and the key points of our presentation today, I want to be really clear. This rule applies to medium and heavy duty manufacturers to meet sales targets. Sales targets by vehicle type are going to increase over time. And the sales targets will begin with model year 2027 if North Carolina adopts the rule by January 1st, 2024. This rule does not apply to fleet owners or operators, individual owners or operators, transit buses, agricultural or construction vehicles that are not on road. If they're off-road vehicles, doesn't apply. We want to also make sure that we're reminding everyone that this is a whole of government approach. There are lots of different agencies working together on this approach. We want to make sure that we're transitioning and advancing to clean energy economy, that we're protecting the public health and the environment, and that we're advancing environmental justice and equity, and also creating good jobs and opportunities for everyone. We're going to take that first step forward by transitioning our fleets in our motor pools. And we also have an environmental stewardship initiative that we're also beginning. Next slide, please. I want to remind you that if you want to check out more of what we're doing, we have a website that's available. And also, if you have comments specifically about our adoption of the Advanced Clean Trucks program and rulemaking, you can send them to our email here, or you can call our phone line if you don't have access to email. Next slide. If you have questions about the outreach that we're doing today or any other public information, you can contact me. You can also contact Sean Taylor, who you've heard his voice on this. For questions about the rule development, you can contact Randy Straight. And of course, our division director, Mike Abrazinskis, is always able to answer questions. Next slide. Our additional contact, Zach Pierce, we wouldn't be here without him. And so he's available for you to talk to. And if you have questions about our environmental justice information, you can contact Elizabeth Christensen or Renee. Next slide. And if you want some light reading in the middle of the night because you can't sleep, then you can go out and look at what other states are doing with their adoption of the Advanced Clean Trucks rule. And that concludes our presentation for today. We're happy to stay on for another couple of minutes and take any last minute responses to some of the questions that we have posed. If we didn't get to your question or we don't get to your question, please put it in the chat because we will be reviewing those at a later time.
I'll just read out a couple things that have come up in the chat since last time. So Jerry asked if the recording will be available. And yes, we will be posting this video recording of today's webinar and make that available on our website. I have provided a link in the chat to the ACT, the Advanced Clean Trucks website that was mentioned on the slide. The slides from today's presentation are also available there. And another comment from Paul. He notes local market development policies to promote NC driver adoption of trucks produced may allow you to claim more benefits on your fiscal note analysis.
Thank you. We don't have any more questions. I'm going to give people back 6 minutes.
No other comments right now, Robin. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone, for the opportunity to come and talk with you all. We had some really good feedback today, and we really appreciate it. And thank you to my co-presenters, Randy Straight and Zach Pierce, and all the people behind the scenes, Sean and the whole translation team. Thank you very much.
Yep, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.